great to have you back for week 8 of International Politics of Climate Change. In this video, we're going to explore geoengineering. So this is at the extreme end of climate mitigation and adaptation intervention at an international level. Geoengineering is one of the most controversial topics in international climate change politics. The debates over these technologies raise many of the common questions about social and economic organisation, about governance, and about justice that lie at the heart of the human custodianship of the Earth. To address these issues through the video, I'll start out by asking what geoengineering is and the type of technologies that fall under this banner. I'll ask why geoengineering might be necessary. And then I'll problematise geoengineering from a number of different angles. I'll look at the precautionary principle and examine the patchwork of international geoengineering governance mechanisms that cover this topic. And finally, I'll finish off by exploring the Oxford Principles, which are a set of guidelines intended to inform the governance of geoengineering. So let's start with some definitions. Geoengineering refers to the use of large-scale technological interventions to alter the geological scale processes of the Earth. Now, there's a number of proposals and a number of different technologies that fall under the banner of geoengineering interventions. And these can loosely be categorised into two camps. On the one hand, you've got solar radiation management, and on the other hand, you've got carbon sequestration measures. So I'll start with carbon sequestration. This is about sucking carbon dioxide out of the sky so the atmosphere will trap less heat, while solar radiation management is about reflecting more sunlight away from the planet so that less heat is absorbed by the atmosphere in the first place. Now, of course, we can make the argument that anthropogenic climate change has itself been a form of unintended planetary level geoengineering through the greenhouse gas emissions of human activities. So the kinds of things we're talking about here in this video are technologies that could reverse that process at a similar planetary scale. Solar radiation management involves blocking solar radiation from the sun from entering the lower atmosphere, and this mutes the turbocharging of the greenhouse effect that's occurred as a result of the increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases that have entered the atmosphere from human activity. Solar radiation management strategies include increasing the albedo of built structures like buildings and roads, to stuff like cloud brightening and spraying aerosol particles into the atmosphere, to even more extreme proposals for placing giant reflectors or mirrors in orbit over the Earth to reflect sunlight before it hits the atmosphere. Technologies that prevent sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface could reduce overall global temperatures within a few years, similar to the effects of large volcanic eruptions. Carbon sequestration strategies are designed to draw carbon from the atmosphere to mitigate the warming influence of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Now, carbon sequestration strategies include a range of different strategies and technologies. So you've got bioenergy carbon capture, which can occur at a household level. At an industry level, there's carbon capture and storage, which could enable the injection of emissions direct from industrial sites into long-duration deep storage underground. For CO2 emissions that are already in the atmosphere, these could be recaptured through reforestation and increasing soil carbon, so using natural strategies, or enhanced weathering techniques, or through ocean ion fertilization or direct air capture. So you can see in the video clip under the heading here, this is an example of a direct air capture plant. It's important to point out that Earth system processes already perform the carbon drawdown role that geoengineering technologies are intended for. The problem is that ecosystems have become so degraded and the pollution of previously locked up carbon into the atmosphere has become so great that the self-regulating carbon cycle has been badly distorted. So the question is, do we need geoengineering technologies to restore the balance of the carbon cycle? The argument in favour of deployment of geoengineering technologies is pretty straightforward. So as we saw in week 3, carbon sequestration is a role that plants perform naturally through photosynthesis. And this is why forests play such a vital role in the carbon cycle. Yet because of increasing greenhouse gas emissions from human activity, as well as the degradation of the world's forests, the sequestration challenge needs to be accelerated with human technology. And if we take this argument to its logical extension, the argument is that we've run out the clock on our window to begin reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations before catastrophic climate impacts kick in. So the only way left to protect us from these extreme impacts is to deploy large-scale solar radiation management and carbon sequestration technologies. In 2006, the Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen called for an acceleration of geoengineering research in his now famous article in the journal Climatic Change. You can see the citation listed here. Now, Crutzen's article was controversial because he'd won that Nobel Prize for his research into the dangers of the hole in the ozone layer. The article was controversial because the sulfur dioxide that's used in one of the major solar radiation management strategies of atmospheric seeding is highly ozone depleting. So in other words, he thought that climate change was such an extraordinary threat that it was worth researching a remedy in solar radiation management, which he knew posed other serious dangers with already known risks. What are the risks associated with geoengineering technologies? Well, first of all, we don't know precisely whether or not they'll work. The IPCC also warns that these geoengineering technologies face large uncertainties and knowledge gaps, as well as substantial risks and institutional and social constraints to deployment related to governance, ethics, and impacts on sustainable development, quote unquote. Research in this field is largely done by sophisticated computer modelling and small-scale, localised field tests. So it remains unknown whether geoengineering technologies can actually work at planetary scale and what the impacts might be, both intended and unintended. So in reality, there's really no way to test at planetary scale without actually deploying these technologies in full. Now, the rapid development and the deployment of COVID vaccines makes for an interesting comparison. Now, I don't want to push this analogy too far, but I think it's worth weighing this up. So as I'm making this video, there still remain questions about the efficacy of the COVID vaccines and the range of possible impacts across the human population as they're rolled out. The vaccine rollout across the world is being hampered by political intrigue, by governance issues, logistical problems, and the corruption of socioeconomic inequality. However, these risks have been deemed acceptable given the magnitude of the known impacts of the pandemic if it's left unchecked. Now, I'm not saying that climate change and COVID are the same, but this does offer some comparative precedent for working through the dangers of the uncertainty gaps in geoengineering. Beyond the unknowns, there's a moral hazard objection to geoengineering, where it's argued that successful geoengineering will give carbon-intensive industries a free pass to continue polluting. Political support for both carbon sequestration technologies and solar radiation management strategies is growing, particularly in some high-emissions oil-producing countries. So there's an interesting correlation there in terms of the political support. We've also seen some industry groups that are associated with the fossil fuel sector and climate denial coming out in support of geoengineering research, which is interesting. So this has raised a red flag with those people who favour a precautionary approach to geoengineering technologies. Nonetheless, solar radiation management and carbon sequestration geoengineering are being actively researched and tested. They're being backed by government subsidies and incentivising legislation in some supporting countries. But this is being done in the absence of a clear legal and regulatory framework at the international level that might be able to temper the risks and the perverse incentives that might end up being catastrophic. There's questions about the risk of technological and socioeconomic lock-in that's associated with these technologies. So deployment of geoengineering tech could mean that we have to keep using them indefinitely to prevent an even greater climate catastrophe, which creates an economic and governance burden in perpetuity. So for example, albedo modifying solar radiation management technologies can only temporarily mask the warming effect of greenhouse gases, and they wouldn't address atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. So in the absence of CO2 reductions, solar radiation management would need to be sustained indefinitely and at increasingly large scales to offset warming, which would have severe negative consequences if these measures were to be terminated for whatever reason. Now, socioeconomic lock-in is the risk that political expediency, bureaucratic momentum and/or sunk costs of investment could keep geoengineering technologies in place beyond their point of technological usefulness. Given the scale at which geoengineering tech would need to be deployed, the consequences of any failure or miscalculation or accident are likely to be significant. So in pop culture, we see this as the premise of movies like The Matrix or Snowpiercer. But in real life, we've seen other great industrial calamities, from Chernobyl and Fukushima nuclear disasters to the Bhopal gas leak in India and the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. And we see from these events that when mega technologies fail, they tend to do so catastrophically. So this needs to give us some pause for caution when we consider about the lock-in effects of geoengineering deployment. Then there's the human hubris objection, which is critical of the mistaken belief that humans can exert control over systems so complex as the biosphere. Or to put it another way, should any human actors, whether they're international institutions, governments, corporations or leaders, be given such a power to play God? We come back again to this ontological question about this dominant ontology of the industrial era, which sees humans and the non-human world as separate. Is this an appropriate founding assumption for the deployment of planet-level technologies that could intervene in the ecosystems that support all life on Earth? If that sounds like a grand statement, it's because it is. That's the level of the stakes involved in this debate. All of these objections bring us ultimately to the core questions about the governance of geoengineering, about who gets to decide how, when and where these technologies are deployed, along with the related social justice angles about who pays for their deployment, who profits and who's impacted. And these questions are all the more important because geoengineering technologies will have transboundary international effects at planetary scale. Now, at the present time, internationally, geoengineering is loosely regulated. What we see is a patchwork of international legal frameworks that were designed for other issue areas, but which have some crossover with what geoengineering is intended to do. So there's a loose regulation based on other issue areas. This creates uncertainty though. So this regulatory uncertainty impacts on how the international community might settle on a global average temperature to aim for. So think about the debates between a 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise versus 1.5 degree temperature rise. Since these technologies will affect different countries in very different ways, so settling on a temperature stabilization target has very tangible impacts with how individual countries develop their climate policies and how the international community comes together to settle on overall adaptation and mitigation goals. Consensus decision-making and dispute resolution mechanisms will be important to the international governance of this geoengineering area moving forward, because extreme adaptation pressures or the corruption of vested interests with an economic stake in these technologies could push governments to go it alone with deployment. So governments might be forced to go it alone if there's no regulatory framework in which to move the agenda forward. So an argument against geoengineering deployment is that there are too many dangerous unknowns to move forward in the absence of a dedicated geoengineering treaty regime. In evaluating whether we should proceed with the development and the deployment of planet-scale geoengineering tech, we can draw on the precautionary principle for guidance. So the precautionary principle has been employed in environmental politics for decades as a means of navigating high-level risk that involves complex systems, where the consequences of actions might be unpredictable. So when the precautionary principle is applied for proposals to new activities, like geoengineering, for example, the proponent of the new action needs to prove that it's not harmful to humans or harmful to the environment before that action is undertaken. And where a new action carries a risk of potential existential harm, then limits should apply to that activity before proof is overwhelmingly established that the risk can be appropriately minimised. There are three important elements of the precautionary principle that are pertinent to geoengineering proposals. So first, the burden of proof lies with the advocates to demonstrate the safety of the new technology. Second, the proposal needs to incorporate ethical responsibilities towards maintaining the integrity of natural systems. And third, the proposal needs to acknowledge the fallibility of human understanding and incorporate appropriate safeguards for unforeseen circumstances. There's always winners and losers when the precautionary principle is invoked. And this is because the upfront costs of minimising precautionary risk are borne by the advocates. But the long-term costs of any negative impacts are socialised and widely distributed. Ultimately, arguments about how to apply the precautionary principle still rest on value judgments about which risks are most important. In the case of geoengineering, the risk of unanticipated damage caused by these technologies needs to be weighed against the risk of catastrophic climate impacts. Let's come back to this governance question again and explore some of the more noteworthy treaty regimes that have got some jurisdiction over elements of geoengineering, which collectively provide that governance by default patchwork that I described earlier. So let's start with the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC originally made no explicit mention of geoengineering, although there's an implied reference to it in the articles on scientific cooperation and technology sharing mechanisms in the text of the convention and also in the text of the Kyoto Protocol, along with the provision for negative emissions technologies which are written into the Paris Agreement. And indeed, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has built its scenarios for meeting global temperature stabilisation at 1.5 degrees Celsius around this idea of negative emissions. And this is a move that's been questioned in some quarters given how speculative geoengineering technologies are. And you can illustrate this in the graphic here. Intriguingly, the term negative emissions technologies is a euphemism for geoengineering that's used in the legal text because it's less politically and morally loaded. And this was inserted at the insistence of states and observer parties that have been championing these geoengineering technologies. Let's look at some of the other treaties that are involved in this geoengineering governance patchwork. There's the Convention on Environmental Modification of 1977, which prohibits the hostile military application of climate modification and explicitly encourages the peaceful uses of weather modification technologies. So what's the history here? Well, many countries have got a long record of research into cloud seeding to increase rainfall, including the US and China. Also, during the Cold War, there were fears that weather modification could be used as a weapon of war, and this is explicitly outlawed in this treaty. There are three particular treaties which are relevant to carbon sequestration ocean seeding technologies. And these are the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a sister treaty of the UNFCCC. There's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which governs maritime boundaries. And there's the 1972 London Convention on the Prevention of Maritime Pollution. But it's important to note, across all of these things, it's the impact on marine ecosystems and marine sovereignty that are the primary issues, not ocean seeding specifically. None of these existing instruments were designed to regulate geoengineering specifically, and this highlights the need for a more comprehensive governance model as these technologies are taken more seriously in the policy sphere. Now, there have been attempts to try and consolidate international geoengineering governance. In 2019, a resolution was voted on in the UN Environment Assembly, which is based in Kenya, that would have centralised geoengineering governance within the UN Environment Agency and consolidated the ad hoc treaty mosaic. Now, interestingly, this vote was blocked by the United States, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia, all of whom have been primary champions of geoengineering research. And I would suggest this highlights the type of vested interests behind geoengineering research in these countries. Others have argued that integrating geoengineering governance under the UNFCCC would make more sense and could facilitate the oversight and confidence building required to lessen the fears that powerful countries might seize the reins of planetary climate modification. Either way though, we should expect to see negative emissions and geoengineering become increasingly prominent as an issue within the UNFCCC process. There is a roadmap, though, for how geoengineering development, deployment, and governance might progress. In 2009, the prestigious scientific body, the Royal Society in the UK, published an influential report entitled Geoengineering the Climate. And this put the debate over geoengineering on the policy map. Following this report, the UK House of Commons initiated an inquiry into how geoengineering technologies should be governed. Through this process, an ad hoc group of academics, including 2 members of the Royal Society, coalesced into a working group. And this working group submitted a list of 5 high-level principles for governance of research, development, and any eventual deployment of geoengineering. And these principles became what's subsequently known as the Oxford Principles. The Oxford Principles were intended to lay down the basic parameters for geoengineering decision-making. Now, like all legal principles, they don't make concrete recommendations, and they're intended to be used and interpreted on a case-by-case basis. So let's explore each of these 5 principles in turn. Principle 1 is about resistance to the privatisation of geoengineering technologies. Geoengineering should be regulated as a public good and never be fully privatised as a for-profit enterprise. If this was enshrined in international law, this principle would limit the private investment in the development of these technologies and neuter some of the players currently advocating for their deployment, who include segments of the fossil fuel industry. Principle 2 is about consultation and consent. So those conducting geoengineering research should be required to notify and consult and ideally obtain the prior informed consent of those populations that will be affected by their activities. The scope of consultation required depends on the technology in question. So for example, carbon capture technologies that geologically sequester carbon within the territory of a single state would require agreement only at a national or local level. However, a technique that operates at transnational scale, such as changing the albedo of the planet by injecting aerosols into the stratosphere, would require global agreement and consent. Principle 3 is about open access. There should be complete disclosure of research plans and open publication of the results in order to facilitate a better understanding of the geoengineering risks and to reassure publics about the integrity of the process. Principle 4 is about independent oversight. An assessment of the impacts of geoengineering research should be conducted by a body that's independent of those that are undertaking the research. And where geoengineering projects are likely to have transboundary impacts, these assessments should be carried out through appropriate international bodies like the United Nations. Principle 5 is specifically about the governance question. So here, any decisions with respect to deployment should only be taken with robust governance structures already in place and using existing rules and institutions where possible. So given the existing governance picture, this principle would suggest that the world's not ready to deploy most geoengineering technologies because international governance arrangements are not yet settled. It is still early days, but expect the geoengineering governance picture to evolve quickly over the coming decade.